Hello, I am Stephen and all my friends are synths. The thing about having friends is that at some point with your friendships you look at them and you think, are we actually friends anymore? What were the reasons we became friends in the first place? Do those reasons still apply the now? And maybe in the worst case scenario, was the whole reason that we became friends built on a lie? And those are the questions I'm asking myself about my old friend here, the Digitakt. When me and the Digitakt first became pals, everything seemed great. There was lots of promises made. There was lots of hopes and dreams. We did a lot together. We had a great honeymoon period. I remember going to London, just me and the Digitakt on the train, and instead of having to lug big, powerful, PSUs about, I could just plug it into a wee portable thing and we made music on the journey. It was something I look back on fondly. We even put out an EP together, just me and the Digitakt. And it was an EP that I still really like. It was a different kind of thing. We experimented with different methods that many people said we shouldn't have tried or would have frowned upon if they'd known we had tried. But it was good fun. And now that makes me sad because as time has gone on, I've realised that some of these promises were hollow and that the original fun we had maybe was just masking some of the deeper problems that existed. And now I have to reconsider in 2021 when we're locked down and we're having to reevaluate every aspect of our life. Is the friendship I have with the Digitakt really worth it? Or is it time for us to move on? I'm at this particular crossroads just now as I've started to make friendships with new samplers and different kinds of devices like the Akai S2000 or the Polyend Tracker. And I'm wondering whether or not it's time to try and rekindle the friendship with the Digitakt or whether I need to just cut my losses and do something else. And so I wanted to talk about this in this video because even though I've called this something like why I've decided to sell the Digitakt, I'm not 100% decided yet and I still might change my mind depending on the outcome of this. So I'm going to talk about some of the reasons that I'm thinking about telling the Digitakt this time we started being pals with somebody else. I should say right at the start that if you're one of these people that hates kind of podcasty style video log vlog, I never liked that word, but if you're one of those people that doesn't like those kind of talking, thought speaking videos, then you're not going to like this, so I would click away just now, or maybe just keep watching so that I get more view time. Whatever you want to do is fine. As I mentioned, when I first got the Digitakt, I was really excited about it, and actually I did make a whole pile of music with it. I put out an EP that was sample based that I've never really done before, and it was such an immediate tool for making music. I could stick samples on it, manipulate them really quickly, and come out with songs that I would never have made before. Part of the reason I got the Digitakt in the first place was because I wasn't really that well experienced or well versed with sample music or making music with samples before that point, and I thought the Digitakt was a fairly reasonably priced sampler when you compared it to something like an MPC or I don't know, the Octatrack even, which was wildly expensive and much more complicated. There were a bunch of problems with the Digitakt that were obvious from the start and that people knew about, or at least limitations, because you're not going to be able to get a full-fledged sampler in this modern era that's a brand new product if you're not going to have some kind of limitations at this price point. But to be honest, the limitations at that point didn't seem a big deal, at least the ones I knew about. So for example, people criticised the Digitakt and still do because it doesn't have a song mode, and to me that was never an issue because I'm not going to write songs on the Digitakt in the sense that I'm not going to write patterns and arrange them in a full song and then press play and just let it do its thing. That's not something I've ever really done. What I would do and what I still do is make patterns and either trigger them to improvise in a jam situation, or else I would just record the patterns into my DAW like Logic or whatever else. So no song mode, no big deal for me anyway, fine, whatever. The second big limitation was that it only records in mono. And weirdly enough, it's got 2 inputs, even though it only records in mono. And I don't know why that is. But anyway, this is another big problem that people saw with the Digitakt. Again, for me, not an issue. I don't really care if the samples are in mono or not. I tend to work in mono quite a lot of the time, and I only apply stereo when it comes to effects and things like that. So unless there's something specific I need that's in stereo, this again wasn't a big deal for me. Didn't matter. The third big limitation of this was its MIDI implementation was pretty crap at the start. It wasn't really something that you could use as a brain to sequence everything. Again, for me, not the intended function of this device. I've got a Squark Pyramid. I had other kinds of sequencers that were actually meant to be sequencers. What I wanted this for was a sampler. So lack of MIDI output stuff wasn't a huge problem for me. Just to note, you can actually sequence things with this, but it's not the best as you wouldn't expect it to be because this is a fucking sampler. Third limitation was the fact that there's only 8 tracks or 8 voices, so you could only trigger 8 things at a time. And this was a bit of a pain, but to be honest, at the time when I was buying the Digitakt, I didn't think this was going to be a big problem. Again, because when you sequence things, then you can change the sample or the source, the voice, whatever sample you want to use, within each track on each step. So even though you only have 8 tracks, that doesn't necessarily mean you only have 8 voices that you can use. And if you're creative with it, then you could have loads of different sounds coming out. And for me, coming from a world where I learned to make electronic music on a tracker from a Game Boy LSDJ, then you had to get creative with the way you would, stack things up and insert them, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to make anything except fairly basic music. So fine, not a big deal for me either. The final thing that I didn't like at the start, or at least which a lot of people complained about, was there's only stereo outputs. So this means that if you've got 8 tracks, you can't get your individual outputs separately. And this was an issue for me, because one of the things I like to do is take the individual outputs of each drum sound and manipulate them differently, stick them through different saturators and all the rest of it. And if you just get a straight stereo output, then you don't really have that kind of level of control. There was a workaround where basically you could pan certain sounds to the left and right. So for example, you could stick your kick out the left, and you could stick your snare and your treble instruments out the right, like the hi-hat and everything else, and this would give you 2 outputs. So that was alright, but to be honest, 2 outputs on an 8 voice machine was not brilliant. Electron assured us that even though the Digitakt didn't have the outputs in an analog physical form, it was Overbridge ready, which meant that it was compatible with their software, which would allow you to stream the audio out over USB to your DAW directly, which meant you could separate out the 8 tracks. And so, fine, this wasn't the ideal solution, but for 500 quid, fairly decent sampling machine, sounded fine to me. Now this is where things begin to take a turn, because it turned out that some of these promises were, I wouldn't say lies, but they didn't quite come to fruition. And some of the things that, didn't seem like a big deal at the start have actually turned out to be a fairly big deal when it comes to the everyday life. Much like any friendship where you think that person's laugh is really annoying, and whatever, it's not a big deal. I don't have to, I can go over that. It's just a wee thing. And then you have to deal with them every day in the office, and you start to think, do you know what, if you laugh one more fucking... The first big thing for me that began to change my friendship with the Digitakt was the output situation, because even though Electron had told us that the Digitakt was Overbridge ready, apparently that didn't mean that Overbridge was ready for the Digitakt. And so even a year or 2, I can't remember the exact period of time, but even a couple of years after people had bought the Digitakt, they still didn't have Overbridge ready and usable for the Digitakt with your computer. So you were stuck with the stereo outputs. And this was something that really annoyed me at the time, because this might be a cheap sampler, or a relatively cheap sampler, but that's a that's a lot of money to spend on something and expect it to do something and then be told, well, it's not quite ready. And to have to wait for 2 years, it begins to sour things a wee bit, especially when Electron went from being, quite, upbeat about it and saying, oh, we're releasing it, we're working really hard on it, to continually pushing things back and having quite a frosty attitude whenever people dared to question the fact that, Overbridge wasn't ready yet or that it was crap. I have to say now, Overbridge is out, it's gone through a few iterations and it does work, but this is still not the ideal situation as far as I'm concerned. The first iterations of Overbridge weren't very good and it took up a lot of setup time. You had to, do all this weird stuff within your DAW to get it to work properly, and so I didn't bother even trying it for ages after my first attempt because it seemed pointless. It was a huge waste of time. Now it is much better, but it still involves a bit of setup, and to be honest, see, when I'm making music, the last thing I want to have to do is go into settings and realise things aren't set up properly in terms of the preferences of some proprietary instrument, just so I can get the tracks out. So even though it does work, it's not my ideal situation, and that's one of the big reasons that I'm thinking of finally biting the bullet and getting rid of it, because I waited for Overbridge and it came and it just wasn't what I wanted. In terms of the other limitations that I've already mentioned, they still aren't a problem for me. I don't care about song mode. I don't use this as a MIDI sequencer. And what was the other one? Doesn't matter because I don't care about it anyway. But there are other things that I don't love about the Digitakt, which is kind of part of the reason that I'm considering getting rid of it, or very close to selling it on eBay. The other main thing that's making me consider selling the Digitakt is the sample memory size. There's only 1 gigabyte of internal memory for sample storage, and there's no way to expand this through the use of an SD card or a micro SD card or whatever else. And this always seemed really strange to me because this is a modern device, and almost every other piece of musical gear that has some kind of memory has the ability to expand it through an SD card, but not the Digitakt. So for a sampler where you can load up all your samples, you can't load up all your samples. You really just have to select some. In some ways, there is an argument with samplers that you can be more creative if you are forced to sample just what you need at the time. And actually, that's partly why I like my Akai S2000, because I don't just sample everything and I then have to pick from 10,000 kicks or whatever. But this was made a couple of years ago or a few years ago. This isn't an old device. This is a modern sampler where you would expect to be able to have your packs from sample packs from Mars or whoever you get them from and have them in there. That's part of the beauty of modern samplers, is that you can have these huge libraries of things and be able to select from them. If I wanted the limitations, I would go with an old sampler. I wouldn't have gone with this. So the lack of memory is a problem. On its own, I could go over the lack of memory. However, transferring stuff to the Digitakt is also a pain. You're not just able to drag and drop audio files onto the Digitakt or onto an icon for the Digitakt when you stick in your computer. You have to use their transfer program. So it's another bit of proprietary software that you're dependent on, which leads me nicely on to the next point. Even if I could get over the fact that the streaming audio thing's a pain in the ass to set up sometimes, and I don't really want to deal with it, and I have to use their application to transfer samples on, and I can only store 1 gig at a time, having to use the proprietary software to do these things doesn't fill me with confidence. I have been around the internet for a long time, and I have witnessed many devices which are otherwise perfectly functional cease to operate because the software or the associated drivers are no longer updated or supported. And I can imagine a time in the not so distant future where there's still these beautiful Digitakt boxes kicking about, but you can't actually stream the audio out of them, and you can't actually update the samples because Electron don't update the libraries anymore or don't update the software. And since we know that macOS tends to break things every time they update them in a way that is not, you can't just fix it by going back and patching things. It doesn't fill me with confidence, and I suspect this is not a device that's going to last in the same way that lots of other devices do, purely because of its reliance on software. Now, I've spoken a lot about the bad things or the negatives, the things that I don't love about the Digitakt, but on balance, I do have to say some things I do really like about it, which are stopping me from immediately just listing on eBay. Those are the fact that the sequencer is very nice. The electron sequencer, people seem to think you either love electron sequencing or you hate it, and I don't really understand why you would necessarily hate it. With trigger locks especially, basically each step of this, you can change the parameters of each sample. You can change the sample, you can reverse things, you can do all sorts of, cool stuff with the sounds on each step, and even micro steps. And that's amazing because you can really breathe life into kind of boring patterns and stuff like that by saying, okay, every random step I want to have a reversed, snare sound or something. And that is something that makes this sound amazing, as long as you're using this as a groove box rather than sequencing it externally. And maybe that's something actually I should mention. There are limitations on this as well in terms of what you can sequence externally or how you can sequence it externally. You can have each track or each sound have its own MIDI channel, which is fine, but that means that then you think, well, I can't have all the sounds on one MIDI channel, but you just have to go further down the octaves, so that's cool. But you are limited. You can't spread certain things across certain keys, across certain channels like you would on an Akai. And I mean, maybe you shouldn't expect that from something like this, because Electron did say that this was just a drum sampler, even though all of their videos and stuff suggested you could do far more with it. But anyway, I'm getting back off track onto the negatives rather than the positives. The other positive that I like, the other thing I like about this is the buttons, because the buttons are really nice. And I don't know if this harks back to the SID station. I don't think it actually does, but it reminds me of the SID station in a weird way, where you get these really nice, like, clacky buttons. And so it doesn't have velocity control, but who cares? I don't care about that either. Partly because I'm crap at making beats. But it's nice. It's nice to use. It's got a nice feel. That might be the positives done with. So I guess that wasn't the most compelling of arguments. At this stage, I am still very indecisive about whether or not I'm going to sell this thing. I really should sell this thing to pay for some other stuff, but I don't want to sell it and then realise that I've made a mistake and that actually you can make patterns really quickly and nicely on this. I guess the real question when it comes to whether or not I sell the Digitakt is, what kind of role does the Digitakt play in my group of friends? For example, I have the Akai S2000, which has so much power in terms of how you spread the samples out over different keys and MIDI channels. It's got 8 outputs, so I can route the different instruments to different outputs. I can apply different effects to them. I can do all that sort of stuff. And whilst it does take floppy disks, so the size of the samples is limited, I expect that limitation. And I've got a USB key. So actually, the Akai S2000 holds more than the Digitakt does. The other sampling device that I have is the Polyend Tracker, and it has an SD card, so I can store every sample I have ever made on it. And whenever I want to just, fire up a quick sequence, that's what I can use. So what's left for poor Digitakt? What role does the Digitakt play in my future when I've got the Akai to sequence externally and I've got the Polyend Tracker to be like a groovebox quick drum pattern maker thing? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. If you do have any particular thoughts about whether or not I should rekindle the relationship with the Digitakt, please let me know, because I would love to hear from you. Even if I just ignore you and do whatever the fuck I want to do anyway, it would be nice. It would be nice to know. I do suspect that what I might do is sell it and then look at the Roland SP404 and 202 combo for no other reason than they at least do something a bit different and a bit interesting in terms of how you interact with samples than the Digitakt does, which is now just living a sad existence on my shelf. That's it. That's all I have to say about the Digitakt. Goodbye.